Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 331 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. Well, it's 2025 and a happy new year to you all, and it begins with some funny old weather. I've been out completing oxalic acid treatments, so stay tuned to hear how that went, and with the new season somewhere in the distant horizon, I'm starting to finalise my plans for the new season. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast and a very happy new year to you all. I hope you all had a fantastic Christmas and a fun time seeing in the new year. Is it just me, or do they seem to come round faster and faster? I think it's the nature of the business we're in, and I think I've mentioned it before, the beekeeping season breaks the year down into such small chunks, and we're driven by what comes next in the beekeeping calendar. Now I know it's not the same for everybody, and I realise that for some, beekeeping is just one of several, if not many, hobbies that crowd the diary. But for a lot of us, beekeeping is a very prominent part of what we do and who we are, and I think this is what drives the breakneck speed of the year's progress. The new year weather has started with an unsettled feel. We're currently in the middle of a cold sandwich, as it were, with a spell of freezing temperatures just a day or so ago, milder for the next couple of days, and then back to very cold sub-zero weather. It currently looks like we may get some lovely winter sunshine, so it's not all bad, but overnight temperatures are set to drop and this will see colonies put under pressure, especially the smaller ones. These smaller colonies will face an uncertain winter and could fail because of the cold weather, being too small to be able to generate enough heat to keep the adult bees alive, let alone maintain enough heat to allow any small patch of brood that they produce to grow and develop. What I mean by smaller colonies are those sandwiched between maybe just two frames, filling just a third to a half of a seam of bees. In milder conditions, we've had tiny colonies like these survive, but at the start of what could be 8 to 12 weeks of cold winter weather, it's unlikely that these will be able to survive. Interestingly, in the past we've had colonies of a similar size to this survive, and it appeared to be due to the hive that they were held in. It all seems to make fairly common sense really when you think about it, yet I do have my fingers crossed in a few cases. Let me explain. Here are the three different scenarios that hopefully explains what I mean. There are obviously lots of different scenarios, but let me just explain using these three. If you take a tiny colony, sandwiched between two frames, as I've just described, and squeeze them into a queen mating nuke box, the volume of the mating box is probably just about big enough for them to fit into, especially if you've taken out the feeder section that some of them have and given them a couple of extra top bars which they've managed in late autumn to draw out and fill with stores. Take the same size mini colony and put them in a poly nuke box such as a BS Honeybees 14 by 12 style. These are the ones that we're using for our overwintered nukes, some of which we may have spare for sale, so if you're interested, drop me a line. But put that small colony into a slightly bigger box and suddenly they have a lot more space to maintain and keep warm. Life becomes a little more tricky for them. In a 14 by 12 poly nuke box they should still be able to survive, but take this example to its final step and put that same small colony into a full-size hive and I would suggest their chances of survival are massively reduced. The volume of empty space around the colony is significantly larger and will cause the bees to have to work so much harder to maintain that core temperature that they need to survive. One solution for these one or two seams of bees type of colonies is to move them into a nuke box, or to remove outside frames and add insulation of some kind to fill that void. I believe we have several colonies in this position, so we may well do just this later in January before any likely freeze that happens in February. It honestly doesn't take long and could be the difference between a colony making it through to spring or not. I'll look to shoot a video of this later in the month, just as soon as I can, to illustrate what I mean. Elsewhere around the apiaries, we've consolidated hives by moving smaller numbers back to our Norwich-based apiaries to save on travel time and hopefully fuel costs. We've completed this as we've carried out our final oxalic acid treatments for Varroa. Those of you who have followed the videos on Patreon will know we've used a once-a-week treatment over a 3-week period because we found brood in a number of colonies as we went around. It's funny, isn't it? We're told not to open colonies in winter, and I would agree with this sentiment generally, but because of this, the majority of beekeepers just won't know if they have any sealed brood in their hives at the time of treating or not. Yet we carry out this treatment because it's what we're told. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't or shouldn't treat at this time, rather that you bear in mind that maybe the colony has had some sealed brood at the time of treating, and when you check your bees in spring, don't be too alarmed or surprised if you do see varroa mites in some quantities. It feels a little bit of a lucky dip really, whether your colony is broodless or not at the time of treating in winter, if you're not opening them up to check. And as I say, I wouldn't recommend people open up their beehives in the middle of winter just to see if there's any brood there or not. The 3-week treatment that we've employed is not free of risk either. There is evidence out there that suggests open brood is killed by oxalic acid treatments, so we could be causing an unintentional brood break in the middle of winter, which in turn delays the emergence of adult bees by around 3 weeks. This could possibly be at a time when young adult bees are desperately needed as the ever-diminishing adult bee population within a winter hive gets close to a critical point of survival. This beekeeping lot can be quite stressful sometimes, can't it? And I'm referring to the bees as well as us. So I would say we choose our treatment strategy and trust the bees get through the winter, either because of our intervention or despite of it. This period then is that switchover moment between years and sees the end of 2024 and the start of 2025, and it gives me a chance to look back at the year we've just completed and start to get those optimistic plans for 2025 in place. So what was 2024 actually like for me? Well, I guess one word that sums up our beekeeping year is average. We had average losses, we had average honey production, and it was overall an average kind of weather year. Split down into seasons though, it was much more of a roller coaster ride. I guess winter last year was quite benign really. Average losses, mainly due to good preparation and the lack of wasps, meant a pretty successful beginning period to that winter and generally overwinter as it stood. That, of course, meant that our spring preparations were on track until I was hit by my late winter issues, which meant we weren't really able to get out as much as I would have wanted around that end of February and into March period. This led us into a stop, start, stop kind of spring, and probably the swarmiest spring period I've ever known. So let me start by saying that the vast majority of this challenge was of my own doing, being unable to get into the apiaries in late February and early March. This, combined with a fluctuating weather pattern of cold, warm and then back to cold weather again, meant the colonies that were rapidly growing suddenly found themselves confined and overcrowded, which, as we all know, is one of the triggers for swarming, and swarm they did. Nearly half of all of our colonies appeared to have swarmed early, and actually, thank goodness that they did. By the time I was regularly back to work, we were into a full-on busy spring period, and we found many of the colonies that had swarmed were well on the way to recovering, building up with a new queen and growing a larger brood nest. It did, of course, hit our spring crop quite hard, so we really didn't take much honey off the bees at all. And actually, thank goodness we didn't, for that little bit of luck really helped the bees survive moving into summer. Let me explain. Immediately we got past the spring flow, our colonies found it hard to find any real forage and chomped their way through pretty much all of the stores that they had. At one point, it even looked like we may have to feed. Luckily, the summer flow came to the rescue just in time, and actually, with the bees clearing out vast amounts of brood cells containing stores, it opened up much more space for an ever-growing brood nest area as the weather turned and we got some much-needed warmer summer weather. We had two main crops through the summer, our reliable borage crop and an unexpected wildflower mix, mostly of clover and the like, sown by one farm in particular as a 3-year kind of set-aside plan. This nectar source seemed to just keep giving. Unfortunately, I hadn't realised until we paid a visit to check in with a few colonies that had been left behind in an apiary after the oilseed rape had flowered, and we didn't take those to the borage. But when we got back to them, they were almost honey-bound, and I guess on the point of swarming. Luckily, only one of those colonies got away from us, and the rest delivered up an average of 3 supers per hive, and it was really lovely clover and wildflower honey. You may recall we had spent some time developing colonies to take to the heather moors for 2024. That was very successful for us, and I will certainly do the same thing for 2025. Our optimism in 2024 was unfortunately short-lived regarding that late-season heather honey crop because of the appalling weather in North Yorkshire and those blasted heather beetles. I'm yet to pop the honey sample from that crop under the microscope to try to identify the pollen types in the honey, because what we came home with certainly wasn't all heather. Oh, and I forgot to say, we had a fantastic time producing cut comb and section squares while we were at the borage, and it was a highlight of the season for me. Other than preparing 14 by 12 nukes to overwinter for sale in the spring of this year, that was pretty much our season. A very mixed bag that ended up being something of an average year overall. But saying that doesn't account for the highs and lows that we had, and another season to add to our experiences and memories. That brings me on to planning for this year, 2025. Obviously, we start from a position of me going back into hospital for another attempt to correct my little heart issue. I'm just very grateful to have it sorted in early January rather than find myself being booked in for an operation in May, June or July. Hopefully they'll get it sorted this time and I'll be back to normal by the time spring arrives. Whilst I may be taking a little time off, it doesn't stop me from planning the year and giving myself something to look forward to. I'm going to back off on colony numbers again, so any winter losses won't be replaced this year, and once the spring nukes are sold, it will again reduce our colony numbers somewhat. This isn't necessarily a permanent change, just a reduction until I know how I stand physically, and hopefully that will be on 2 feet. But it will give me a little more time to get things done and not be charging around to breakneck speed, and I hope in turn it will give me more time to focus on our videos and of course this podcast in supporting and hopefully entertaining a few beekeepers out there. I would like to get some queen rearing set up, maybe demonstrate the various methods in order to produce just a single queen or produce dozens of queens. It's a very satisfying process and one that I do miss. I just know there will be some genetics in there that will produce grumpy bees, but we'll just have to deal with those. In other areas of the business, we have more than enough honey in store to be able to not worry about honey for our stockists for a year or two, and that means it has a knock-on effect with what we need to produce. We do have some very loyal stockists, but only a few. They love our honey, and I would rather maintain those relationships than stretch ourselves to the point of running out of honey. This means we can devote more time to the mechanics of beekeeping rather than worrying about our honey production along with everything else. And that means we can focus on techniques and tips for you in our videos and in this podcast. If you're listening to the public release of this podcast, most of what I've said will have already been decided and discussed with our podcast subscribers on Patreon. Did I mention if you subscribe to our podcast, you'll also get access to all of our videos as well. All of that for probably less than the cost of a posh coffee or a pint of artisan beer. For those of you listening on Patreon, thanks again for your support. Thanks for your kind comments recently, and I look forward to catching up with you all in the next week or two. If you've any questions or beekeeping issues you want to ask, just drop me a message or an email. I'm going to be at home getting bored for the next couple of weeks at least, so I'll be happy for the contact. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.